The biggest mistake of his life. He shouted, "Disappear!" and slammed the door. 6 years later, the millionaire CEO froze when his son stepped out of a limousine. Ethan Vance had built his life on control, on never wavering when others hesitated, on silencing doubt before it could take root. As the CEO of a vast investment empire, he was used to people obeying his every word, to doors opening before him, to his commands being treated as law. In his world, there was no room for weakness, no space for mistakes, and certainly no tolerance for complications of the heart. That was why, when Clara stood before him in his office with trembling hands and eyes that held both fear and hope, telling him she was carrying his child, his carefully cultivated facade cracked into fury. The blue of his eyes, normally cold and calculating, burned with something sharp and merciless. He did not consider the sleepless nights she must have endured before coming here, or the courage it had taken for her to face him with the truth. All he saw was a threat to his order, a disruption to the pristine empire he had built brick by brick, and he lashed out. His voice, usually calm and commanding in boardrooms, rose like a whip. "Get out of my sight! Disappear!" he shouted, and when she flinched, he turned away, slammed the heavy door shut, and told himself it was finished. For Clara, that moment was not just rejection, it was annihilation. She stood in the echo of the slamming door, her body shaking, the words reverberating inside her skull like a cruel mantra she knew she would never forget. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her heart, had erased her with a single order. She pressed a hand to her stomach, where the tiny life inside her grew, and felt hot tears slip down her cheeks. It wasn't only her pain she carried now, it was her child's future too, and she realized in that instant that she was truly alone. The glittering skyline she could see from his office window seemed mocking, each shining light a reminder of the distance between his world and hers. She turned and walked out, her steps heavy but steady, refusing to collapse in the place where he could still see her weakness. Ethan, for his part, convinced himself he had done the right thing. He poured himself into work that night, staying long after his staff had gone, pretending that numbers and charts could drown out the echo of her voice. He told himself that women came and went, that children born out of mistakes had no place in his carefully ordered life. Yet beneath the anger, beneath the certainty, there was a flicker of something he refused to acknowledge. Fear. He had always prided himself on control, but the image of Clara's face, pale with shock, haunted him despite his efforts to bury it. When he left his office hours later, the silence of his empty penthouse felt heavier than usual, but he dismissed it with the same cold logic he had used all his life. Clara's night was different. She returned to her small apartment on the other side of the city, her clothes damp from the rain that had begun to fall, her mind spinning with the enormity of what had just happened. She sat on the edge of her bed, the room dimly lit by the weak glow of a single lamp, and let herself cry until her throat was raw. She thought of his eyes, of the way they had once softened when he looked at her, and how now they had turned into ice. She thought of the promises she had whispered to herself during sleepless nights when she imagined telling him, and how quickly those hopes had been crushed beneath his anger. But as the hours passed, and her tears subsided, something else began to take hold inside her. It was not the fiery passion of love she had once felt, nor the cold despair of rejection, but a slow, steady flame of determination. If he would not be a father, if he would not share the burden, then she would carry it alone. She looked around her apartment, at the second-hand furniture, at the peeling paint, at the faint sound of the city beyond her window, and realized it would never be easy. She would face long days, sleepless nights, and a future filled with uncertainties. Yet when she placed her hand once more on her stomach, she felt a fierce, protective strength rise within her. This child was hers, and she would love it enough for both of them. Ethan Vance might have slammed the door on her, but he would not define her future. She whispered a promise into the quiet of the room, her voice unsteady but resolute. "You are not alone. I will never leave you." And with those words, Clara stepped onto a path she had not chosen, but one she would walk with unyielding courage, a path that would one day lead her face to face with the man who had tried to erase her, and with the child who bore his eyes. A life built on strength. Clara quickly discovered that survival required more strength than she ever imagined she possessed. The weeks after Ethan's rejection blurred into a rhythm of exhaustion, fear, and determination. Her savings were almost gone, and each day presented a new obstacle. Rent overdue notices slipped under her door, long shifts at the library where she fought to keep her eyes open, and the constant gnawing worry of how she would provide for the child growing inside her. She traded her own comfort for necessity, skipping meals to save money, mending her clothes instead of buying new ones, and learning how to stretch every dollar until it almost tore. She often sat late into the night at her tiny kitchen table, a pile of unpaid bills in front of her, her hands trembling as she tried to calculate how much longer she could keep going. Yet every time she thought despair would swallow her, she pressed a hand against her stomach and reminded herself that she wasn't fighting just for herself anymore. Pregnancy was harder alone than she had expected. She faced doctor's appointments with no one by her side, hearing her child's heartbeat for the first time while wiping away tears in silence, wishing there was someone to share the miracle with. Each flutter of movement inside her body filled her with joy, but also sharpened the pain of knowing that the man responsible wanted no part of it. When she walked home from the clinic through busy streets, surrounded by strangers rushing past, she often felt invisible, as if the world had already decided her story was too small to matter. Yet she refused to crumble. She told herself over and over that her child deserved a mother who would not give up, even if the father had already walked away. As her belly grew, so did her determination. She found ways to prepare, setting aside a small box in her bedroom where she collected baby clothes from thrift stores, toys discarded by wealthier families, and blankets knitted by a kind older neighbor who had taken pity on her. Every item she placed in that box felt like a quiet victory against the man who had slammed the door in her face. She whispered to her unborn child as she folded the clothes, promising that no matter how little they had, love would always be abundant. Those whispered promises became her anchor, a way to push back against the fear that threatened to undo her on sleepless nights when her back ached and her future felt uncertain. Clara went into labor on a stormy night, alone in her apartment, the rain pounding against the windows as she struggled through the pain. By the time she was rushed to the hospital, she was shaking with exhaustion, her cries swallowed by the sterile walls of the delivery room. Hours later, as dawn broke, she held her son in her arms for the first time. His dark hair was damp against her chest, and when he opened his eyes, they were the same piercing blue as Ethan's. The sight made her heart lurch painfully, but then the baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, and in that moment, she felt a surge of love so overwhelming it eclipsed everything else. She named him Leo, a name that meant strength, because she knew both of them would need all the strength they could find. The days that followed were both beautiful and brutal. Leo cried through the nights, leaving Clara staggering from lack of sleep, her body still aching from childbirth. She rocked him in her arms until her muscles burned, sang to him when she could barely keep her eyes open, and sometimes wept quietly into his soft hair when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But every time he smiled, every time his tiny lips curved into that innocent expression, it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She lived for those smiles, for the warmth of his small body against hers, for the proof that even out of rejection and cruelty, something pure and extraordinary had been born. Clara learned to navigate motherhood with fierce determination. She returned to work sooner than she should have, leaving Leo in the care of her neighbor while she poured coffee at the cafe in the mornings and shelved books at the library in the evenings. Her body protested, her spirit flagged, but she pressed on. She counted coins at night to make sure she could afford diapers and formula, often choosing to go without dinner, so Leo would never go hungry. She told herself it didn't matter if she wore the same worn dress day after day, if she had to sacrifice sleep and comfort, because Leo deserved better. And slowly, despite all the odds stacked against her, they carved out a fragile but unbreakable life together. Clara often wondered what Ethan would think if he saw them. Would he recognize himself in the blue of Leo's eyes? Would he feel guilt, or would he turn away again, dismissing them as he once had? The questions lingered, but she never let them consume her. She decided that his choices no longer defined her or her son. Leo was hers, wholly and completely, and she would raise him without shame. Still, deep in her heart, she knew that one day their paths might cross again, and when that moment came, he would finally see what he had walked away from. A father's redemption, Leo grew quickly, each year unfolding like a chapter Clara read with awe and exhaustion, marked by small triumphs and quiet sacrifices. By the time he turned 3, he was already curious about everything around him, tugging at Clara's hand in the park, asking questions about the sky, the birds, and the people who passed them on the street. His energy seemed endless, his laughter infectious, and though Clara's body often ached from long shifts and sleepless nights, she found strength in the sound of his joy. Every milestone felt like a victory wrestled from the jaws of despair. The first word, the first wobbly step across the living room, the first time he wrapped his arms around her neck and whispered, "Mommy," in a voice that melted every scar she carried. Yet the joy was shadowed by the inevitable questions that grew more pointed as Leo got older. At first, they were innocent. Why don't I have a daddy? Why don't we visit him? But as he reached school age, the curiosity sharpened into longing. He would watch other children being picked up by fathers, their hands tucked securely into larger ones, their laughter doubled by the presence of someone who belonged to them. Leo would turn to Clara with his wide blue eyes, so much like Ethan's that they pierced her heart every time, and ask quietly if his father might come one day. Clara would kneel, brush his hair back, and give the same answer she always did. "You have me, and that's enough." But each time she said it, she felt the weight of the lie pressing harder. Clara tried to fill every gap with love. She worked double shifts when she could, sacrificing her own needs to pay for Leo's art supplies, books, and the occasional treat that made his face light up with wonder. Their apartment remained small and modest, but she made it a home filled with warmth. Pictures Leo drew were taped to the walls, bright scribbles that turned the peeling paint into a gallery of color. The fridge was decorated with magnets and notes, reminders of school events, and little drawings he made just for her. At night, they would sit together on the couch with secondhand storybooks, Leo leaning against her as she read until his eyelids grew heavy. She told him fairy tales where heroes fought monsters, but deep down she knew the biggest monster she had ever faced was the man who had abandoned them. Despite the struggles, Clara never let bitterness seep into her interactions with her son. She wanted Leo to grow up believing in love, not poisoned by her own pain. Still, Ethan's shadow lingered in every blue glance, in every sharp tilt of Leo's chin that mirrored his father's, in every smile that seemed to echo a face she wished she could forget. Sometimes at night, after Leo had fallen asleep, Clara would sit by the window and stare out at the city, wondering if Ethan ever thought of them, if he ever felt even a moment of guilt for the life he had cast aside. She doubted it. Men like him did not look back. But what Clara didn't know was that Ethan's life, though gilded and glittering on the outside, had begun to feel emptier with each passing year. He had everything that money could buy: cars, penthouses, women who fawned over his wealth. But none of it anchored him. He buried himself in work, closing deals that earned him headlines. Yet in the quiet moments when the crowds dispersed, a hollow ache settled into his chest. He told himself it was loneliness, a small price to pay for the empire he had built. But deep inside, he sensed it was something else, something tied to the memory of a woman with dark hair and brown eyes, who had once looked at him with love before he drove her away. Meanwhile, Leo grew into a boy of 6, his personality blossoming. He was clever, quick with words, sometimes stubborn, and always hungry to prove himself. Teachers often remarked on his intelligence, his natural leadership among his peers, but Clara heard other whispers too. How he seemed to carry a kind of sadness, how he often looked out the window during class, as if searching for something he couldn't name. When she asked him about it, he would shrug. But she saw the truth in his eyes. He longed for a father he had never known, a piece of himself he couldn't quite grasp. Clara resolved to protect him from the pain she knew would come if Ethan ever reappeared. She told herself it was better this way, better for Leo to grow up without him than to be wounded by his indifference. And yet, despite all her determination, she could not shake the feeling that one day their paths would cross again. She didn't know when or how, but she felt the inevitability of it, like a storm brewing on the horizon, unseen but certain. What she didn't realize was that fate was already moving the pieces into place. Ethan's empire, his carefully constructed life, would soon collide with the small, fragile world she had built for herself and her son. And when it did, no amount of walls she had built around her heart would be strong enough to withstand the truth that was waiting to break through. The collision Ethan's empire had reached a height that few men could dream of, yet the higher he climbed, the more isolated he became. His name appeared daily in financial journals, his face on glossy magazine covers, his life chronicled as though he were the embodiment of success. He arrived at boardrooms in tailored suits that cost more than some people's salaries for a month, his words carrying the weight of authority that silenced entire rooms. To the world, he was untouchable, a man who bent markets to his will, a visionary who could not fail. But behind the facade, cracks were beginning to show. Each evening when he returned to his penthouse overlooking the city, the silence pressed down on him with unbearable heaviness. The walls were lined with expensive art, the floors polished to perfection, but the air felt stale, lifeless, a reflection of a life lived in isolation. Ethan had become accustomed to filling the void with temporary distractions. There were women who admired his wealth, who clung to his arm at charity galas and whispered sweet nothings in expensive hotel suites, but none of them stayed, and none of them touched the emptiness gnawing at his chest. He gave them gifts, treated them to dinners that cost more than most people earned in months, but at the end of the night, they always left, and he was once again alone with his thoughts. He told himself this was the price of power, that men like him were not meant for family, not meant for permanence. Yet in the quiet moments, when he removed his tie and stared at his reflection in the mirror, he saw something that unsettled him. His own eyes, cold and blue, staring back without warmth, without life. What he did not realize, at least not consciously, was that the memory of Clara haunted him more than he dared admit. He had told her to disappear, slammed the door on a future he hadn't wanted, yet her face, framed by dark hair and filled with a mix of sorrow and defiance, sometimes flickered into his thoughts without warning. He buried the memory under work, under deals and headlines, but it never vanished completely, and sometimes, in the stillness of night, he wondered, not about her, but about what she had carried away with her. He had convinced himself that whatever life she had built no longer concerned him, but deep down, there was a fear he would never speak aloud. What if she had kept the child? What if there was a son or daughter out there who bore his blood, his name, his face? The thought came like a knife, quick and sharp, before he pushed it aside with ruthless efficiency. Ethan Vance did not dwell on the past. Meanwhile, Clara lived a life far removed from the glittering towers where Ethan reigned. Her world was measured not in millions, but in hours and dollars, carefully stretched to cover her son's needs. She walked him to school each morning, holding his hand as they navigated cracked sidewalks, his small backpack bouncing against his shoulders. She worked shifts that left her weary, but her evenings were filled with Leo's chatter, his questions about dinosaurs, his excitement over a new book from the library. For Clara, wealth was not something she could hold in her hands, but something she felt in the warmth of her son's embrace. She saw Ethan's features in him every day, the blue eyes, the shape of his jaw, the determined set of his chin, and though it brought a sting of memory, it also reminded her that Leo was more than the product of rejection. He was proof that love could exist even when born from cruelty. As Leo grew, his resemblance to Ethan became undeniable. Neighbors often remarked on his striking eyes, unaware of the story behind them, and Clara would smile politely, while her stomach tightened. Each time she heard those comments, she felt the past rising again, pressing against the walls she had built around her heart. She knew one day Leo would demand answers, and she dreaded the moment with every fiber of her being. She told herself she would be enough, that her love would shield him. But the truth whispered through her fears. No matter how strong she was, a child would always long to know the other half of themselves. On the other side of the city, Ethan's restlessness grew. His empire was thriving, yet satisfaction eluded him. He found himself distracted during meetings, his thoughts wandering, his temper shorter than it once had been. He snapped at employees for minor mistakes, ignored the congratulations that came with each new success, and spent long nights pacing in his penthouse, staring out at the city lights as though they could answer questions he refused to ask himself. It was as though some invisible thread tugged at him, pulling him towards something he couldn't yet see, something he didn't even know he had been missing. Neither Ethan nor Clara could have imagined how close their worlds were about to collide again. Fate was moving quietly in the background, arranging pieces on a board they had both tried to abandon. The man who had once slammed the door to protect his empire, and the woman who had walked away carrying more than her own broken heart, were both on a path that could no longer be avoided. The question was not if they would meet again, but when, and whether Ethan would recognize the reflection of himself staring back in the eyes of the boy he had never met. It was a warm spring afternoon when the collision finally happened, though neither Ethan nor Clara could have predicted it. Ethan had just concluded a series of meetings with international investors and was on his way to a high-profile dinner at one of the city's most exclusive hotels. The valet rolled a gleaming black limousine to the curb, and the marble steps leading up to the entrance gleamed under the sunlight. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his pale gray suit, his expression carefully composed into the mask of calm authority that had become second nature. The cameras from a gossip magazine snapped nearby, but he barely noticed them. He was a man who commanded attention wherever he went. His presence as much a performance as it was reality. Yet beneath the polished surface, there was still the emptiness he could never quite shake. Just as Ethan prepared to step inside, another limousine pulled up. He glanced over absently, expecting to see more of the city's elite arriving for the event, but what he saw instead stopped him cold. The door opened, and a young woman emerged, her dark hair catching the light, her brown eyes alert and steady. She was dressed simply, yet with a quiet elegance that drew the gaze even among the opulence around her. For a moment, Ethan thought his mind was playing tricks on him. He had not seen Clara in 6 years, had buried the memory of her face deep under layers of denial. But here she was, standing only a few feet away, unchanged and yet profoundly different. Before he could process the shock, another figure stepped out of the car. A boy, around 6 years old, with dark hair tousled by the breeze and eyes so piercingly blue that Ethan felt as if he were staring into a mirror. The boy adjusted the strap of his small jacket and looked around curiously, his hand reaching for Clara's without hesitation. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was not possible, and yet the evidence stood before him. The resemblance was undeniable. His eyes, his gaze, even the way the boy tilted his chin with quiet defiance. Every detail screamed of truth. This was his son. Ethan's polished composure faltered for the first time in years. He felt his legs weaken, his chest constrict, as if the weight of the world had suddenly pressed itself upon him. He wanted to move, to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He watched as Clara smoothed the boy's hair, her expression calm and protective, and he realized that she had carried this secret alone for all those years. The child he had demanded she erase from existence had grown into a living, breathing being, one who now stood in front of him, with the same blue eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. Clara noticed him then. Their eyes met across the polished steps of the hotel, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to vanish. The noise of traffic, the chatter of guests, the clicking of cameras, all of it fell away. Her gaze was sharp, filled with something he couldn't name, not just anger or hurt, but also resilience, the kind of strength born only from years of carrying a burden without help. She tightened her grip on the boy's hand and moved to walk past him, her chin lifted, refusing to acknowledge his shock. But before she could, the boy tugged at her sleeve and looked directly at Ethan. "Mom?" the child asked softly, his voice clear enough for Ethan to hear. "Is that him?" The word sliced through Ethan like a blade. His chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The boy's innocent question carried all the weight of years lost, of choices made in anger and arrogance, of a door slammed shut that should never have been closed. Ethan wanted to fall to his knees, to cry out, to explain, but he could do nothing but stand frozen as Clara gently guided her son past him, her eyes never softening, her steps never faltering. He turned to watch them go, his entire body trembling, his mind spiraling into chaos. For 6 years he had lived as though his decisions were final, as though he had erased the past with a single word. Yet here it was, alive and undeniable, walking away from him in the form of a boy who carried his face and his blood. For the first time in his life, Ethan Vance, the man who had never hesitated, never doubted, never bent, felt powerless. And as the limousine door closed behind them, he knew with a certainty that no wealth, no empire, no carefully built walls could protect him from the truth any longer. That night, long after the dinner had ended and the hotel lights dimmed, Ethan sat in his penthouse, staring out over the city, haunted by the image of the boy's blue eyes. He could not escape it. The reflection he had denied for so long had found him, and nothing in his life would ever be the same again. A chance for redemption. Ethan did not sleep that night. He sat alone in his penthouse, a glass of untouched whiskey on the table beside him, the city stretching endlessly beneath the windows, like a kingdom that no longer felt like it belonged to him. The vision of the boy's face, so strikingly similar to his own, replayed in his mind again and again. He tried to bury himself in numbers, flipping through documents left on his desk, but the words blurred into nothing. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's expression, steady, unyielding, filled with both strength and quiet accusation. And then he saw the boy's innocent gaze, the question that had pierced his chest with more force than any failure or betrayal ever could. Is that him? For the first time in his life, Ethan felt something he could not quantify, something that left him raw and shaken. Fear. Not the fear of losing a deal or of scandal or even of failure, but the fear that he had lost something irreplaceable long ago and would never be able to regain it. The idea that there was a son out there who bore his blood, who had grown without him, who might even hate him without knowing his name, left him hollow. He thought back to the night when Clara had come to him with the truth, when he had chosen pride over compassion, arrogance over love. He had told her to disappear, and she had obeyed, but she had not destroyed the life that had been growing inside her. She had protected it, nurtured it, and in doing so, she had created something greater than he had ever deserved. By morning, Ethan knew he could not continue as though nothing had happened. He searched for Clara's number, a task that would have been impossible for most men, but not for him. With the resources at his disposal, he tracked her down within hours, though when he finally held the phone in his hand, staring at the digits on the screen, he hesitated. His thumb hovered over the call button, his pulse quickening in a way he had not felt since he was a boy. It was absurd. He had faced senators and billionaires without blinking, yet the idea of hearing Clara's voice again made him feel like a coward. Finally, with a breath that shook more than he wished to admit, he pressed the button and listened as the line rang. When Clara's voice answered, steady and cautious, Ethan almost hung up. But then he heard a sound in the background, the laughter of a child, light and carefree, and he knew it was his son. His throat tightened, and words failed him for a moment. Clara's silence stretched, her patience thinning, until he finally spoke her name. She did not say his in return. Instead, she asked, cold and sharp, "Why are you calling me?" Ethan wanted to explain everything, to pour out the regret that had been festering inside him since the moment he had seen them outside the hotel. But all he managed was the truth, stripped of eloquence. "I saw him," he said. "I saw our son." The silence on the other end was heavier than any accusation. When Clara spoke again, her voice was controlled, but he could hear the tremor beneath it. "You lost the right to call him that the day you told me to disappear." He closed his eyes, her words stabbing deep, but he did not hang up. Instead, he asked for something he never thought he would beg for, a chance to see the boy again. Clara's refusal was immediate. She told him that Leo had grown without him, that he did not need the chaos Ethan brought, that she had built a life strong enough to protect her son from the man who had abandoned them. Ethan listened, absorbing every word, but he did not give up. He promised he would not disrupt their lives, that he only wanted to see his son from a distance if that was all she could allow. Clara scoffed at the idea, anger sparking in her voice, and ended the call. Ethan sat staring at the phone long after the line had gone dead, the weight of her words crushing him, but not extinguishing the fire that had ignited in his chest. Days turned into weeks, but Ethan did not let go. He appeared outside Leo's school, never approaching, only watching from across the street as Clara walked her son in each morning. He memorized the way Leo's hand fit into hers, the way he laughed at something she whispered, the way he looked so alive in a way Ethan had not felt in years. It was torture and salvation all at once. He told himself he would wait, that he would endure her anger, her mistrust, her walls, if it meant one day his son might look at him without confusion or fear. Clara, for her part, noticed him. She felt his gaze even when she pretended not to, her anger simmering at the audacity of his presence. She wanted to hate him, wanted to drive him away again. But each time Leo laughed, she wondered if she was wrong to deny him a father who now seemed desperate to repent. Her heart warred with itself, torn between protecting her son from the man who had once abandoned them and acknowledging the reality that Ethan was no longer the same cold figure who had slammed the door 6 years ago. The tension between them grew, unspoken, but undeniable. Ethan was no longer content to live in silence, and Clara could no longer pretend he did not exist. They both knew that a confrontation was inevitable, one that would decide not only their future, but also the future of the boy whose blue eyes bound them together in ways they could not escape. The path forward. Clara had managed to avoid him for weeks, but fate had a way of forcing collisions when neither side was ready. It happened on a Saturday morning at the small park near their neighborhood, a place Leo loved because of the swings that creaked when the wind blew and the pond where ducks gathered for breadcrumbs. Clara had taken him there after a long week, her plan simple: let him run and laugh, let herself breathe in the quiet. She never expected Ethan would appear, tall and unmistakable in a tailored jacket that seemed almost too sharp for such a modest place. She saw him before Leo did, her stomach tightening with that familiar mix of anger and dread, but she had no chance to retreat. Leo's eyes caught the stranger's form, and instead of shrinking back, he froze, his small hand tightening around Clara's. His expression was one she had never seen before, curiosity mingled with recognition, as if some part of him instinctively knew what his heart had long suspected. Ethan approached slowly, not with the arrogance he carried in boardrooms, but with a kind of hesitation that looked strange on him, as if he were stepping onto fragile glass. His eyes never left Leo's face, and Clara saw something raw in them, something she had not believed possible from him. Fear, not of power or loss, but of rejection. When he finally stopped a few feet away, the silence between them was heavy, broken only by the chatter of children playing nearby. Mary's instinct screamed at her to shield her son, to pull him close and walk away, but Leo's grip loosened. He stepped slightly forward, his eyes locked on Ethan's, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Are you my dad?" The words shattered Ethan. For 6 years he had built walls, hidden behind wealth and authority, yet a single question from a boy he had never held tore through everything. His throat tightened, his voice caught, and when he finally answered, his tone was unsteady in a way that surprised even him. "Yes, Leo," he said softly, "I am." Yet he expected anger, maybe tears. But instead, Leo simply stared, his expression unreadable, as though weighing whether this stranger was worthy of the word. Clara felt her chest ache at the sight, torn between the urge to protect her son from disappointment and the realization that this was the moment she could no longer prevent. They sat together on a nearby bench, an awkward triangle bound by silence and unspoken words. Leo asked questions with the blunt honesty only children possess. "Why weren't you there? Where have you been? Why did you leave us?" Each one cut through Ethan, and for once he did not hide behind excuses or charm. He told the truth, as much as a man who had once been blinded by arrogance could admit. He confessed that he had been a coward, that he had chosen ambition over love, and that he would regret it for the rest of his life. Clara watched him carefully, waiting for manipulation, for some twist of words to absolve himself. But instead, she saw a man, stripped bare of pretense, humbled in front of the son he had never held. Leo listened, his young mind struggling to understand the complexities of adult failure, but he heard enough to sense sincerity. His small hand reached out tentatively, resting on Ethan's, and the gesture nearly undid him. Ethan bent forward, tears he did not care to hide falling as he whispered, "I don't deserve this, but I will spend every day proving to you that I can be better." For the first time, Clara saw not the ruthless CEO who had destroyed her world, but a man broken and desperate to rebuild something he feared he had lost forever. The days that followed were tentative steps towards something none of them knew how to define. Ethan showed up at the park again, bringing books for Leo, listening as he talked about school and his dreams of becoming an astronaut. He offered to walk him to class, to help with homework, to do the small things fathers often take for granted. Clara watched with cautious eyes, still wary of the man who had once slammed the door in her face. But she could not ignore the way Leo's smile widened, the way his laughter grew fuller with each visit. A wall inside her, one she had built stone by stone over years of pain, began to crack. Yet trust was not easily restored. One evening, after Ethan had left, Leo looked at her and asked, "Is he really going to stay this time?" The question pierced her deeper than she expected. She kissed his forehead and promised she would protect him no matter what. But inside, she wondered if Ethan was capable of keeping the promise he had made silently, with every desperate glance. She told herself that time would reveal the truth, and until then, she would stand guard as she always had. Ethan, however, knew that he had no choice but to stay. He had spent years building an empire of glass and steel, but now he understood that his entire life meant nothing without the small boy with blue eyes who had called him Dad for the first time. And though Clara still kept her distance, though her eyes still carried caution, he began to hope that perhaps he could earn not only his son's trust, but hers as well. Time moved forward, not in leaps, but in small, fragile steps, and each one carried Ethan closer to a life he had never imagined wanting. Weeks turned into months, and with every visit, with every shared laugh or quiet conversation, the distance between father and son began to shrink. Leo grew more comfortable around him, no longer watching him with cautious eyes, but instead running toward him at the park, or eagerly tugging at his sleeve to show him a new drawing, or tell him about something he had learned in school. Ethan marveled at each discovery, each little detail of his son's world, and though he mourned the 6 years he had lost, he cherished every moment he was allowed to share now. What struck him most deeply was not the boy's resemblance to himself, but the warmth and kindness Leo had inherited from Clara, qualities Ethan realized he had once been too blind to see in her. Clara remained cautious, her heart divided between the instinct to shield her son from possible disappointment and the undeniable evidence that Ethan was changing. She watched him arrive not with the arrogance of a man used to commanding attention, but with the quiet patience of someone willing to earn his place. He no longer brought gift as if they could buy affection, but instead offered time, helping Leo with school projects, sitting cross-legged on the floor to build model airplanes, or simply listening to him with a focus Clara had never seen from him before. Each act chipped away at the image she had carried of the cold, unyielding man who had once ordered her to disappear. Yet the memory of that night never left her completely, and she often lay awake long after Leo had fallen asleep, wondering if trust was something she could ever fully give back. Ethan, for his part, was determined to prove himself not with words, but with persistence. He adjusted his life in ways that astonished even him. Meetings that once consumed his every waking hour were rescheduled or delegated. Business trips shortened. Entire weekends cleared. His colleagues noticed the change and whispered about his distraction. But Ethan no longer cared about appearances. The empire he had built still mattered, but it no longer defined him. He discovered that what filled the emptiness inside him was not another acquisition or headline, but the sound of his son's laughter echoing through a modest apartment, or the quiet smile Clara gave when she thought he wasn't looking. The turning point came one evening when Ethan joined them for dinner at Clara's apartment. It was a small, ordinary meal, pasta with sauce and a loaf of bread from the corner bakery. But for Ethan, it felt like a feast. He sat at the table with them, watching Leo chatter about his day, watching Clara laugh softly at his excitement. And something shifted inside him. He realized that this was what he had been missing all along. The simple intimacy of family. The connection money could never replicate. When Leo reached across the table to hand him a piece of bread, Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. It was such a small gesture, but it was filled with trust, with acceptance, and it broke down the last of the walls he had built around his heart. Later that night, after Leo had gone to bed, Ethan lingered by the door, unable to leave. Clara stood across from him, arms crossed, her eyes still cautious but softer than they had been in years. He struggled to find the words, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "I can't erase what I did," he admitted, his gaze steady on hers. "I can't give you back the years I stole, or the nights you spent alone, or the tears you shed because of me. But I can give you everything I have now. I can give Leo a father who will never walk away again. And if you'll let me, I want to give you the man you deserved all along." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she did not answer right away. She studied him, searching for any trace of the man she had once known, the one who had broken her heart. What she saw instead was someone humbled, someone who had been stripped of pride and remade by love he had once rejected. Slowly she nodded, not as a promise of forgiveness, but as an opening. A chance for something new to grow, where everything had once been destroyed. The weeks that followed solidified what had begun that night. Ethan became a constant presence, no longer hovering at the edges of their lives, but stepping fully into them. He took Leo to school in the mornings, attended parent-teacher conferences, learned how to cook simple meals with Clara, guiding him in the kitchen, though they both laughed at his clumsy attempts. Clara began to let down her guard, not all at once but in fragments, until one evening she found herself leaning against him on the couch, Leo asleep across both their laps, and she realized that the life she had once thought impossible was unfolding before her eyes. Ethan never stopped carrying his regret, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it fueled his determination to honor the second chance he had been given. He knew he would never forget the moment he had told Clara to disappear, but now he understood that love was not about erasing mistakes. It was about choosing every day to do better, to be better. He had once slammed the door on a family he could have had, but now he stood inside with them, the door wide open, vowing never to close it again. And so, against all odds, their story did not end in bitterness, but in something unexpected and extraordinary. Out of rejection had come resilience, out of sorrow had come strength, and out of one man's arrogance had come redemption. For Clara, for Ethan, and most of all for Leo, the broken pieces of the past had been reshaped into a future none of them had thought possible, one built not on pride, but on love.